Let me introduce Marianne Peace, who's a co-chair of the Energy Policy Study Group, joining us today from Connecticut. And so welcome, Marianne.
Thank you all so very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And Bernie, recognizing you as my co-chair on the Energy Policy Act, it's with great pleasure that I introduce Mark Foster with his presentation on energy options for South Central Alaska. Not only has Mark been a friend, but a professional associate of many of ours over the years, but he's been a huge supporter of Commonwealth North. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Stanford and his master's degree from the University of Fairbanks. He served on the Alaska Power and Telephone Board of Directors, the Anchorage School Board. I know he was the CFO for Peter Pan, and he has had his fingers in the energy discussions of most importance throughout our state. And the thing that Mark brings to the table is an understanding of the economic as well as the financial analysis that goes into energy policy options. And, you know, if you don't have the economics working there with the technology, you don't have a sustainable plan. And I am very much looking forward to Mark's presentation today. And again, thank you, Mark, for your valuable time and insight that we're going to hear from you today. Take care.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for that generous introduction. And I want to thank Bernie and Marianne for having me before the committee today. It's been a distinct pleasure to work with Commonwealth North over the past few decades and really appreciate the work that they've been doing, helping illuminate some of the public policy issues that we face. I'm going to switch to screen share and just dive in and go fairly quickly through a lot of information, and hope to answer questions at the end that people may have, knowing that this time will go fast. All right, the South Central and Rail Belt Energy Outlook, some challenges and opportunities for Commonwealth North. I'm going to look a little bit at the history of sort of the Rail Belt energy system, and some of the big ambitions that we've had and some of the scaled down ambitions that have come out over the decades. Partly I do that because I started in the Rail Belt energy sort of conversation in the 1980s, looking at hydro projects starting out, and then later at coal-fired power plant up in Fairbanks. So I want to sort of take some of that accumulated knowledge and bring it to bear. Then look at the South Central outlook, which is really dominated by questions about where are we at on natural gas, where's the sort of the price and volume on natural gas going forward for the Cook Inlet. Then step back and just make some observations and try and stretch out and paint some strategic choices, and then provide at least a first cut at an evaluation matrix to start thinking about, all right, which strategic choices might be the most robust ones to make in light of the outlook. And then at the end, for people, there are excerpts from my CV, bunch of regressions, bunch of material related to the Cook Inlet natural gas price and regressions, so you can see where many of the assumptions came from. I have no competing interest to declare, so that's documented there. And then there's several data sources that are documented. With that, I really do want to start sort of on the big picture and remind people that the historic context we have are several governors in the public policy arena looking at the oil wealth and what are we going to do with it? Invest in financial resources, and then along the way, invest in infrastructure. So I would offer that the sort of the first really big bit of wealth that came along post 1977 with the pipeline was Sheffield looking at the Susitna hydro projects, where Bechtel came up with 2 dams as a development program that totaled 1,880 megawatts. 4-dam pool came out of that, PCE came out of that, and later sort of the residual money was then roughly 50% funding for Bradley Lake. Hickel, I think, is the next big one with the infrastructure. He enjoyed some uplift on oil prices and talked a lot about investing in mega projects and sort of big projects to build the state. Knowles came along and really focused on rural sewer and water, partly as a result of the oil prices being down. Murkowski focused on the gas pipeline. Palin, with the price spike in oil that came along 2004 to 2008, had Steve Hagenson join her at the Energy Authority, and they pitched essentially a Susitna-Wautanah dam. Started out at about 600 megawatts, downsized to 460 in the FERC licensing process, and kept some air in the natural gas pipeline. Parnell had oil tax reform and really seeking to extend out the oil patch renaissance and keep it from the production from declining. Walker and Dunleavy more recent, I'll let you guys sort of look at that. I do highlight under the Dunleavy administration the recent announcement of the Dixon diversion as the large hydro project in their portfolio. And I have some observations about that being a relatively small project and a relatively expensive one. And it just strikes me as an odd one that fits in the mix here relative to the prior sort of administration. Alaska context that you're all familiar with, but just a reminder, in terms of the oil pipelines, first full year of performance was 1978. It was the summer of 77 when they turned it on. And that really did change the energy picture for us, both on the production and consumption side. There's just the Alaska consumption trail for those who want to remind themselves of what our state consumption is. I highlight for you 2 things in particular. Natural gas consumption, of course, is going into producing additional oil and gas. That's the predominant item. And then the other items that came in there were LNG export and the fertilizer plant, which have subsequently shut down. So you can see that trend in their natural gas. The other big item on there, I think, is for people to remember, is the jet fuel, as the Anchorage airport in particular grew to be a very large cargo hub and remains one. On the end use energy consumption side, when you normalize it for trillion BTUs, you can get a sense of the picture here. It's natural gas is the big sort of source of energy in the room, and it is primarily the industrial use to develop oil and gas resources. And you can see the trend line over time there that we described a little bit earlier. Primary energy production here, you can see the difference between the peaks and the current sort of state of affairs on coal, natural gas, and crude oil when we look at it on a BTU basis. And you'll see things like the wood roughly flat, other renewable energy roughly flat, crude oil down from the peak of 2 million barrels a day, natural gas down because we're not doing the export and the fertilizer, offset slightly by the amount of natural gas production that we need per barrel of oil, since we're not just producing the Prudhoe Bay at the peak. Let's skip through these. It's really, their energy flow diagrams are useful if you're a student of the game, but it's a lot to go through in a short presentation. So we'll get to the highlights. Basically, when I think about the context, as we look across the 1970 to 2022 timeframe, we have a series of oil price surges that have sort of spurred development in Alaska, spurring development of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. Subsequent oil price surges after the pipeline was in place have spurred investments, public investments in hydro and renewable resources. Kodiak will be a great example to look at the hydro and wind resource there and the storage and flywheel system they put in. The heating sectors continue to chase natural gas when it can, with fuel oil and wood serving more remote locations. The transportation sector continues to ride the oil price waves. The Cook Inlet industrials were essentially priced out when we went away from a Henry Hub sort of pricing scheme, and even prior to that, essentially a co-product pricing scheme. And then when we diverged to what I'll call our islanded market scheme, we got priced out on those things. I do think there's some really interesting emerging opportunities that are smaller scale in CNG and the NGLs, particularly propane off the slope. Hopefully we can get some presentations on that going forward to enjoy the innovation that's going on there on the margin. A couple of things to observe as I think about the big picture over time and what's happened to residential electric rates as one of the segments of the market. If I look at the residential rates in certain sectors of Alaska, and you'll see rural diesel as a result of many of the communities that have had wind added. The rate ratio between rural Alaska and the US has declined from about 5.5 to under 4 over the roughly 20-year time period. The Kodiak hydro and wind play, their rates, the residential rates have declined from roughly 2 times the national average to 1.5 as a result of their investment. Southeast hydro, Sitka, Ketchikan, several other communities across Prince of Wales Island basically have enjoyed a long history of hydro, and that has continued to put them in relatively good stead on their electric rates coming down below the national average in terms of the ratio. The rail belt on natural gas has continued to see its rates increase relative to the national average. So it's an interesting trend line relative to the rest of the state in that regard. The big driver, of course, in the rail belt is the natural gas price, and it's, let's call it 85, 86% of the electric generation is coming off of gas. Most of the heating is coming off of gas, and the transportation market's dominated, as you know, by world price of oil translated through to gasoline, diesel, and avgas prices. And the correlations there are pretty tight. Drilling into the natural gas for Cook Inlet, when I go back to the integrated resource plan that was put together by the Energy Authority in 2009 and sketch out their nominal price projection for natural gas, that's on the orange. I adjust that going forward to take into account the state co-investment in natural gas. As you may recall, Representative Hawker and Larry Persley put together a package of a little over $60 million to help drill for natural gas in the Cook Inlet and essentially helped subsidize some of that exploration and development work, which sort of shifted the cost curve out on the Black and Veatch work for the AEA. And then against that, I've also plotted the Cook Inlet prevailing values from the Division of Oil and Gas. So you can see they're tracking the trend line, but lagging a little bit. And these are all nominal dollars. One thing I'll note in the context of that earlier integrated resource plan was there was an assumption that in the 2030 timeframe, or roughly in that timeframe, that natural gas pipeline from the North Slope to South Central would be built, and that would curtail and put essentially a price lid on what we'd be paying for natural gas in the Cook Inlet. As we think about the Cook Inlet outlook here I'm taking a chart from the DNR natural gas availability study in March 2018. The projection at that point in time was assuming 80 BCF. There, going forward, the actual demand has continued to decline, almost following the trend line from the last few years. We had COVID, of course, that impacted it. We've had some rebound, but there's been an outflow in terms of the total number of customers, so that we're seeing a decline relative to that prior study in terms of the market demand. The potential, so that demand's going down while we have potential backfill from that study from Kenai Fertilizer, LNG export, Donlin Gold. They cited interior gas for heating. I have added to that, for the purposes of sort of keeping track, the coal conversions that might come from Fort Wainwright, Aurora Power in Fairbanks, and Healy plant number 2. The supply estimates you're familiar with in terms of our decline. That's just there to, so we can remember the magnitude of that. So what did I do to get a handle on, get my arms around the Cook Inlet natural gas price, which is going to drive a whole bunch of our assumptions about what's competitive and what might not be over the time horizon? I took the work from March 2018 that DOG put together, and I said, all right, let me look at that scenario, understand the prevailing market value in the market relative to their cost projection, so I can see what the market price is relative to the cost, and review the drivers of that market premium and apply that market premium going forward to the estimates. And then also, consistent with the Black and Veatch approach and the Alaska Energy Authority Integrated Resource Plan, develop an estimate of the LNG import price umbrella, which I think we'll find is definitely going to show up here as the supply curve projected by DOG starts to get into the real price range in that 10, 12, 14. I think that's really where you want to start asking yourself, what might an LNG import price be, and what kind of competition might there be on LNG imports to sort of cap essentially the price in the Cook Inlet. So in the appendices, you'll see a bunch of regressions that basically come down to this blue curve in nominal dollars is my first cut at what's it going to cost for natural gas in the Cook Inlet. Recognizing we are a small market relative to other markets on the Pacific Rim, but we're also relatively well located on Great Circle navigation from various suppliers, which would potentially include British Columbia, Russia, Australia, and Qatar. So there's a number out there on the nominal dollars to compare to the Black and Veatch, and then I've also compared it to a McKinsey projection on Asian gas prices. Long and the short of it is, I think you've at least got to consider as a scenario $12 to $14 per MMBTU on a real basis long term, if you're looking at natural gas on what I'll call the investment horizons for infrastructure. So it's it's definitely a bump up from where we're at today. If I look at the quarterly filings of Chugach Electric, I've got about $7.60 as the price in their projection, their most recent projection. So I think it's essentially in the range of potentially doubling on a 10, 20, 30-year horizon relative to where it's at today. So with that, then I start to go, okay, what is that? How does that natural gas look? Let's call it $12 real, without any carbon capture and sequestration, using the combined cycle units that we have today and not having any capital on them, and the peaking at that sort of those units. So that gives you a sense of the range per megawatt hour that we'd be paying for that gas. And then we can compare other generation alternatives based on taking the old Energy Authority Integrated Resource Plan and escalating those costs as one methodology. And then the other methodology is just to basically look at the costs and apply Alaska multipliers to them as a cross check. And as a result of that sort of approach, I've got some estimates of Glacier Fork Hydro, Chakachamna, the Low Watana, Devil's Canyon and High Watana, sort of the big project, and the geothermal projects that the AEA and MLMP had in their IRP circa 2009. So from that, you get a sense that the hydro and natural gas is certainly looking competitive if I'm looking at those integrated resource plans and the screening studies and the kinds of resources they were looking at in the hydro side. If I go forward and think about the potential for requirements for either a carbon tax or carbon capture, you can get a feel for the relative magnitude of the costs for natural gas going up on the combined cycle side, roughly not quite doubling. And what I think is also quite interesting is I went ahead and looked at what I have from my coal files about life extension of coal-fired power plants from Fairbanks with CCS and a completely new coal-fired power plant with carbon capture and sequestration. And I'm not so sure that given that price trajectory on the Cook Inlet and the price trajectory on coal, that those are in similar neighborhoods in terms of long-term pricing. Diesel remains above that, and that's at $24 per million BTU as my base case. The Dixon diversion, when I look through the June report from Dowell and comb down the numbers and make sure they have all the costs lined up for owner's costs, and then look at the output of that plant on a levelized basis, assuming a 50-year time horizon basically for the hydro and a 4% discount rate, I'm at 30 cents a kilowatt hour. It's a very expensive project on its face. So it's sort of a curiosity as to why that one somehow made it through the screening studies, and the prior sort of portfolio of hydro projects that were front and center at the AEA 12 years ago appear to have all fallen away. That's very curious to me. The other thing I think that's interesting to sort of think about is the wind prices relative to those dispatchable type units down below. I think basically wind's somewhere in the 100 to 150 range, depending on where you're at. And offshore has some advantages in terms of mobilization relative to some of the onshore sites, but it's still relatively expensive to develop in Alaska. Solar PV at the utility scale, I expect you'll see prices below that from vendors. I don't think they're recovering their full cost. And so I do think it's really sort of an interesting development as I look at solar. And for those who are following lithium-ion battery storage, that's a 16.7% capacity factor, which is frequently used by NREL, gives you a sense of what a megawatt hour coming out of that battery costs based on the battery itself. So that's the puzzle that I've been able to discern so far, and conclude that gas looks like it remains well positioned in the near term to be a very competitive source of energy. But as I go out and face the basically likely price escalation, due in part to a tight gas market with very little competition on the margin, and sort of a long-term prospect for LNG import that remains uncertain, I think it's in that time horizon that you start to look at hydro pretty seriously, but you want to look at which hydro project you're developing. Because I think some of the hydro that's popped up onto the radar screen look very expensive relative to those gas prices. That's really sort of it in a nutshell on that. A couple of observations from the local electric co-ops. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in moving to more renewable generation or reducing carbon output. But the scale of these projects are relatively modest compared to what I see in other utilities around the country, and certainly relatively modest to what we saw at Kodiak. Other observations, one I made earlier, it just strikes me that we've moved from a prior regime where we were thinking about the wealth that we were accumulating and putting it into infrastructure to a current arrangement where we're talking about relatively modest and expensive things, but really are really quite small. On the other observation I'd make is the North Slope development wave that's currently underway. I think does look quite promising as I look across the North Slope. And I do think the Tesoro refinery and the imports that it gets will help sustain the Anchorage jet fuel for some time and keep it as competitive as it can be given international markets. I do think on the natural gas side, we want to be cautious about the natural gas pipeline from the North Slope. Current prices in international natural gas markets are clearly starting to create demand destruction on the development horizon that we're talking about in that 10-year horizon. And so I think that's a curiosity about whether we'll really be able to sustain a big play there at prices anywhere near what some of the more ambitious projections show in the world markets. Cook Inlet, continues to decline on the production side, and the prospect for LNG import, I think, continues to grow. The other big, I think, thing to be mindful of is there's a hunt for federal support for carbon capture and sequestration, potentially a hub in the Cook Inlet. I think there's a significant uncertainty around the potential scale and cost of that sort of work, and the ability to attract and retain the wide-ranging skilled workforce necessary to execute on a transition to a CCS hub at scale looks pretty speculative. Wind and geothermal, despite having what appears to be a vast resource endowment, not a lot of support that's discernible at the state level relative to the support for oil and gas. And so I think they're at a bit of a disadvantage when we talk about the proverbial who's got the subsidies on a level playing field basis. I do note that the solar is a relatively modest resource endowment here. Capacity factors might be 12% in a year, but they continue to attract attention as costs decline. I see the outlook on the fuel side for some biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels experimentation at small scale here as federal subsidies get deployed by folks who are probing that area. As I think about the basic strategic frames, what are the basic options we face? We can pivot to the large Hamiltonian scale renewable energy infrastructure that Sheffield and others were thinking about. Could downsize that to even the 600 megawatt sort of ambition or the 460 megawatt ambition that the Susitna Low Watana project got to sort of anchor the renewable transition. Or we can go what I'll call the muddle through all the above energy plays at smaller scale by chasing those federal subsidy opportunities. My worry in some of that is the monopolists and oligopolists in the markets that we're in, which are not very competitive, are the ones standing in line for subsidies and frequently get them and can buy down some of their otherwise expensive plays. And including in the monopoly form, I would call the Alaska Energy Authority a monopoly. It basically holds Bradley Lake and the area around it as a monopolist and is willing to promote its sort of portfolio over some of the other what appeared to be competitive portfolios that it found previously. Finally, I think the other option to think about is, all right, let's double down on oil and gas and go for a big carbon capture and sequestration play and try and build up the scale that's available to do that, not just for oil and gas exploration, but for the utility combustion services that they provide and translate that oil and gas into energy for us. So I do think there's some interesting opportunity there if you tried to run that hard across all the rounds of federal investments that are available, and think about what will happen in the second rounds as the lower 48 folks who are looking for grants from the Inflation Act find themselves not being able to execute on some of the projects because they can't get them permitted. And lots of lower 48 projects getting too blocked, even I think more acutely than what we see here. So I would leave you with the thought that those are sort of the three big options. As you think about which one you want to play, think through what's the demand and how is each of those options going to meet the market demand, both across the export Pacific Rim and the domestic demand. What kind of supply chain do you need to support each of those? What's the competitive outlook? How many competitors are you going to have? Or is it going to be a pretty tight market and you're going to be a price taker rather than a competitive price system? The government policy support across each of those, the technology trends, how will the capital markets respond to each of those plays? And finally, are we attracting and retaining talent in each of those sort of segments? And then sum it up and ask yourself, how well did we do? Not clear to me that any one of those particular sort of strategies is a winner at this point in time. But if I go out 10 years and sort of ask myself where I think things will be and then project another 10 out, then I think my bias goes toward, I think the market will continue to demand cleaner energy. So small scale pilot projects aren't going to get us there. So I think you want to push the strategic consideration toward one or the other of the plays. I'm not, which is to say the clean fossil fuel play or the scale up renewable play. I'm not sure trying to do both will result in success in either lane. So after that, resume, et cetera, thank you very much for indulging my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Mark. Thanks for your presentation. And just for the audience's information, we will have a recording of today's session along with a PDF of Mark's slide deck available for you to review hopefully later on today or at the latest early next week. Additionally, well, let's see, we've got 3 Commonwealth North board members on here, and I know a bunch of other energy wonky thinkers here. So we're going to open it up to questions and answers, and I'm going to turn to our board members first. So Marianne, Bernie, and Isaac, in turn, if you have a question for Mark, let's start with you. For the rest of the audience, if you want to ask your question live, please turn on your camera and raise your hand. If you have other questions, you can put them in the chat feature and I'll read them to Mark. So Marianne, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much for that well thought out and developed presentation. It certainly does present those strategic options, not only available today, but going out over the next 10, 20 years. So Mark, what's the silver bullet? You didn't give us the silver bullet. I mean, I'm sitting here going, well, if I had to pick one silver bullet right now, it might be imported LNG. Maybe I'm there, with the price of gas in Canada.
Maybe I'm looking at, a larger scale renewable project. What is the Mark Foster silver bullet that he believes we are going to be migrating to, given the cleaner energy, agenda that we know is before us?
Right. I don't think there is a silver bullet. I do think what we have is, let's call it a 4-year planning horizon, just to sort of sync it up to the gubernatorial election cycle, because the governor has a lot of opportunity, given the resources he or she can advocate for, that they can make a significant difference. If you look at the history of the larger projects that have been very beneficial to a lot of communities across the state, they really did involve gubernatorial support, and frequently support that either was carried across multiple terms or picked up in subsequent terms in order to make those projects sort of get them over the finish line, whether it's Bradley Lake, the 4-dam pool, et cetera. So I think that in that frame, I think there's a strategic choice. You can muddle through and sort of chase all the federal grants and do a lot of little projects and see what comes up. Or you can push in more on one side or the other on what I'll call oil and gas and cleaning it up through carbon capture and sequestration, both at the exploration and development phase and through the combustion phase at the electric utilities. And I think that's an interesting play. I think North Dakota in particular is leaning in that direction. And I think that's a play where you would be competing with North Dakota. And then the renewable play, which is pushing more of your resources and investment sort of strategy toward renewables. And I would advocate for trying to find cost-effective ones. I think is a play that you see emerging in places that I would have thought previously were not as amenable to that. And I'll put Alberta in that category while still supporting oil and gas. Its renewable portfolio exercise is certainly accelerating. Australia is accelerating its renewable portfolio. And so I think that's the competitive environment you're in. And you want to just ask yourself, where do I go in that environment? And I think partly it's a quantitative analysis of the risks that you're going to face at small scale, and then can you scale up and attract the teams who can operate at larger scale? And it's just not clear to me that we can scale up on either of those sides. I think muddle through is the most likely option, and I don't think it's the one that will produce the most value. That's my concern.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, Bernie, or go ahead.
Mark, great presentation. I guess the question I have is in Cook Inlet, exploring for natural gas. There is natural gas in Cook Inlet, according to, DOE and other studies that have been going on for decades. Now with your price going up to about $12 CFM, is that going to be enough money to get some people to start actually exploring and drilling more in Cook Inlet? Or do we need to have a large industry to put the, to sell the gas? Right now, we are a very small market for natural gas. I mean, utilities are pretty much it. Since we lost Agrim back in the day, we just don't really have a large market. So the question is, how can we start having exploration in the Cook Inlet for natural gas that has said, studies have said that it's there, it's just going to be expensive. But is it the $12 going to be enough? I guess I'm asking you because I don't think it is.
and I think if we take the 2018 study from DOG on its face, extend it forward to 2022, and then look out and go, what's the price to develop the resource based on the geology and the projections? What's the escalated cost to develop? Because even drill strings right now are very expensive relative to what they were back when the estimates were developed. And what margin do you need on top of that cost? I think you get into that $12 to $14 range. And remember, that's sort of a long-term real price. And so I think when you get in that range, it's easy for me to imagine small explorers having enough sort of upside potential to put at-risk capital to chase opportunities in that range.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bernie. And Isaac, did you have a question?
Hi, Mark. Thanks for that great presentation. I was at a conference down at NREL a couple weeks back ago that was focused on ports and airports. I'm just kind of thinking about the future of where those major pieces of infrastructure are headed. And it wasn't a conference that was billed as being on hydrogen, but it ended up being a conference on hydrogen. And specifically, I had my ears really perked up for the color of hydrogen that folks were talking about. And it was, Airbus and Joby Aviation and Zero Avia and Fortescue Future Industries and Plug Power and, a lot of these kind of big players. And it was all green, which one of the reasons I went to this conference was just kind of to hear that issue. And I heard it, I think you said at the end, and I don't mean to misquote you, but it sounded like you were saying, if we have like one way to go where we're looking at clean fossil fuels or another way to look at renewables, we should probably choose one or the other. I agree. I have a bit of a bias, but I agree. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on this. I think there's some interesting efforts underway in Alaska to look at blue hydrogen and also other efforts to look at green hydrogen. I'm a little concerned as an Alaskan that we might invest a bunch of money in one color only to find out that in 20 years the world wants the other color. So thoughts on what's driving this, on what's the smartest way to approach the hydrogen conversation as a state, and is it being driven by politics or economics? Big question.
I think the short answer is it's being driven by the availability of federal financial support in pilot projects will be what I think the Alaska outlook will be. And so I expect we will see both blue and green in that muddle through lane for a while. And specifically with respect to hydrogen fuels potentially competing in the transportation sector, that muddle through lane for a few more years may not be bad relative to the muddle through lane for electricity, which I think is a different play. I think electricity is a faster play. The renewables are getting more cost competitive sooner. So you want to really think about it. But on the hydrogen play, I think you got some time. And particularly given the price differential between green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, green hydrogen has a lot of ground it has to make up in order to win that war. So that would be my cautionary note. So I wouldn't want to say go one side or the other quite yet, but within 10 years, I think we'll have a pretty good idea of how that's shaping up. And it wouldn't surprise me that methanol and ammonia wind up taking the market here in that 10-year horizon. And then we're still scratching our head going, what's next?
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, we've got a question from Harold Hines, and then I'll go to some chat comments and questions, but go ahead, Harold.
Number one, Mark, great. And it's great to see you again. I haven't seen you in quite a while, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to say some things maybe that fit me or don't fit me. But I will argue my age entitles me to a defense of maybe I'm drifting off or whatever. But I was really impressed with your analysis, and yet I felt kind of cheated because I thought you stopped or didn't cover some things that I was kind of waiting for the great reveal at the end there or something, and it didn't happen. So I'm challenged to immediately put those on the table with you. And I mean it in the kindest way of just saying, number one impression I have is that I think a lot of this dialogue and what you were analyzing is filtered. And I don't think it's necessarily filtered in a way that gets you to the best ideas and the best support and the best chance of succeeding. Okay. And a lot of that has to do with, as a state, we still think we can pick winners, which you can't. And we still think that we're smarter than people who actually spend money and make decisions and build projects and have to sort of operate them and make a buck to payroll folks and things like that. At the same time, it seems to me that the choices that are highlighted in the table or the analysis are ones that are based on basically technologies and thinking that is maybe 10, 20 years old. And we're trying to apply that to look at things that are 10 and 20 years out. And we've got to find a way to open that door. And while we can respect everything in the past, why can't we seem to kick the door open and go look at some crazy stuff in the future and that. And for instance, with Bernie there, I've one of the most interesting things I've seen recently is some of the activities in terms of geothermal activities up at his little place. Okay. And they're very small, very modest. It's refrigerator size. Okay. But on the other hand, the basics of that, I will tell you as a good solid engineer for decades, they're good. And that's the kind of thinking we ought to have. The other part is I can't deny that I have a bias. As you went over the list of governors, I was struck by the fact that I worked for a lot of those people over the decades. And there's only one or two of them that I was ever impressed with in terms of being into energy and understanding what the choices were and maybe thinking about the right things. And the part that's missing from the list based on that experience is we're missing the one thing that we did get more votes on than anything else was a crazy little organization called ANGDA, which had a public corporation of the state. It got away from having any ties to any one company or anything. It took a very business-like approach to it with a board of directors dominated by public people who represented all the state. And there was a lot of dialogue and we actually hung around for quite a while and actually made some advances thinking on only one issue, in-state gas. One issue, one lousy issue for 9 years. And we actually did it to a degree well beyond where anybody else, I would challenge, has ever gotten. We actually had transportation commitments that we were in and things like that. We could have moved the gas and so on. And it's that kind of thinking that I think is still out there that's right. I think the public needs to be involved more. I think we need to be willing to think about focusing down, even though it may not make sense to investors, on Alaska and saying, what can we do in Alaska right now to make our situation better? And I think there are things out there right now that if they're not shovel ready, they could be. And they're not big, they don't solve all the problems, but they make it better in Alaska. And so again, I'd love to see your analysis kind of added to. I'm not going to take anything away. I thought you raised some very interesting question marks, and I look forward to your answers to those sometime. But I think we ought to have more things on the list that you are analyzing. And I think that's where the value lies here. And that's a hell of a long question.
Great. Thanks, Harold. Let's hear Mark's reflection.
One on geothermal, you'll notice in that stack in the slideshow, geothermal is very competitive.
Yeah,
and I expect it will continue to be very competitive. The nut that we have to figure out on geothermal is how to essentially provide the support for an exploration program similar to what's been done in New Zealand and other places that had a pretty big geographic span that they had to figure out, and then go, all right, how do we make sure that we're supporting geothermal comparable to a level that we've supported oil and gas exploration over the decades? Once you do that, then you can basically you have an exploration program, and it's highly likely, based on the conversations I've had with essentially the scientists at Geophysical Institute who've looked at the information they have on geothermal resources, that we have resources that are commercial. So I concur with that assessment. I think we can get there, but you do have to find the money for that exploration phase. And that's the hard part. Second one, CNG and propane on the North Slope, I think, are two of the things that are emerging that are going to provide additional opportunities, and they're mentioned in one of the slides. And so I hope things like that get additional support.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Harold. Thanks, Mark. We're going to turn to some of the questions and comments in chat. Mark, Tony Izzo is with us, and he's a member of the BPMC, and he's commenting that as past chair and member of the board that he's not aware of the Dixon diversion project being approved for anything other than a study. Do you want to comment on that?
No, I just want to encourage people to take a good hard look at the economics that appear to be revealed in the conceptual study work that Dowell has done. It looks like a particularly expensive resource relative to other hydro resources that are in the archives that are relatively well developed from the 1980s time period, when we had a lot of money and we poured a lot of money into essentially reconnaissance on hydro resources.
Let me just add a question to that, Mark. Does your analysis take into consideration any additional benefits or externalities, such as redundancy of generation or distribution from that location?
I didn't take into account any incremental value at that location. I basically said, if it's a hydro project, what incremental value would a hydro project provide on the sites that have been previously analyzed?
Sure. So I think probably maybe Tony would want to come online to speak to that from the board perspective, but I do. Go ahead, Tony. Unmute.
There we go. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, I think, boy, there's a lot to unpack there, Mark, and I lived through some of it. I think Harold makes a good point, because I would add a few things under the resumes of some of those governors that unintentionally really damaged us in terms of pricing. The Henry Hub cost us, under Murkowski administration, took $1 billion or more out of the economy. The tax credit churn, I thought that was a kind way. For me, that Cook Inlet Recovery Act almost resulted in saving MEA members $10 million a year after tax. And then the rug was pulled out from under us, once again, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. That was kind of the second strike. But one of the realities that someone in my position is looking at is when you're all of a sudden faced with legislation for a renewable portfolio standard that does zero economic analysis from NREL, zero. Their assumption was you take today's fuel prices, you compound them by 4% a year, and the soundbite that came out of that was, we're going to save $500 million a year in 2040. Absolutely absurd. So I hired Black & Veatch. They did the analysis and showed that it was probably a 24% increase in rates, because somebody's going to have to pay for the infrastructure, the debt on it, the maintenance on it. And then if we stick with non-firm renewables, I'm still going to have to back that up with something firm. I guess my point is that sometimes we look at things like Dixon diversion, which again is not a sanctioned project. It's an opportunity that's being analyzed that I think somehow got caught up in a press release as if we're going to do it. But sometimes we're looking at it through the lens of, well, how does it look economically compared to the fines that are being lobbied for in irresponsible legislation? So thanks.
All right, thank you, Tony.
And as I'm sure you noted, I tried to stack up hydro against hydro from the prior integrated resource plan. So at least we were in the same ballpark.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions from chat for you, Mark. Dave Reese is with us and he's asking about what's your assessment of the talent and workforce that we need to support some of the strategies that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think the short answer is we are short on talent and workforce on any of the strategies, including the muddled through strategy. We don't have enough people to even chase down the grant opportunities and folks who have sufficient sort of technical expertise to provide a foundation for a lot of that. So I think we really are in the development mode for any of those strategies. And it's not clear to me where that sort of development will get supported, whether it's public sector or private sector. I do think there's some nascent work being done among the regional Native corporations to build up some of that talent to be able to chase some of the federal opportunities. But I think it's pretty light. And I'll sort of conclude on a note from a conversation with Exxon once upon a time, probably about 30 years ago, talking about gas to liquids from the North Slope. They laughed and said, no, there's just not enough sort of technical expertise to run a complex plant and sustain it. We need a bigger market and a bigger sort of university community adjacent to that space for a highly technical sort of chemical plant. And I thought that was a very interesting response to the why not. And I do think that's still something that I try to be mindful of.
All right. Okay. Still have two more from chat. Steve Colt is with us and he's asking, what about HVDC from North Slope gas-fired electricity?
And I'm sorry, Steve, I have not updated my cost files and performance files on the high voltage direct current so that I could have a sort of an informed guesstimate about how that would compare to anything else. I just haven't gotten around to it. My apologies.
All right. So maybe another option out there. Erin Whitney is with us online and she's asking, related to the talent and workforce question, in your opinion, can the university be playing a more impactful role in growing the trained workforce? Your comment, and especially with regard to the Exxon example, certainly seemed to indicate that alignment of university, private sector, and would be required to grow the workforce.
Yeah, no, that's certainly my experience with conversations either directly on a board or with other folks who are in management and sort of board level conversations about strategically where are we going to put our investments. More and more those conversations come down to, do we have the teams to develop and then support whatever it is we're trying to do, and is it sustainable? Because we just, there are too many sort of train wrecks that are out there that people have seen where they haven't been able to do that. So I do think a university, a strong university, is an absolute requirement for areas where we're trying to develop new technology or trying to deploy existing technology in a way that's new to a region.
Great, thank you. Well, let's see, one more. Jim Strandberg is online with us. He's asking, what should state government be investing in for controlling future energy costs to foster long-term economic development? Where would you prioritize those state dollars?
I think the first thing you want to do is you want to find the most attractive projects by letting the state help with reconnaissance, whether it's geothermal exploration, whether it is sort of what technology is the right one for Alaska context. It's sort of the R&D piece, I think, is what the state needs to focus on, and allow that commercialization phase to be scratched at and done by folks who are in the sectors where there is risk capital and they pay the price when they miss the mark. And so it's only after you go through that process that maybe in what I'll call a bake-off manner, does the state then put some money in if it's got multiple competitors for a particular thing, whether it's geothermal, oil and gas, wind? I think you really want to avoid going down lanes where you don't have competitive alternatives, where you have serious competition at the margin. And let me just sort of end on another example of that. Trinidad and Tobago, when they're trying to develop an LNG export, the companies that were involved even went so far as to have 2 front-end engineering and design processes running against each other to sharpen their cost estimates before they went to the next phase. 2 feeds was expensive. And at the time, everyone said, why are we doing that? And the answer is, we need competition at the margin when we're in a space where technology is rapidly developing, because we're trying to problem solve and trying to figure out how to adapt something new. So I do think that's the key, is to really ask yourself, where do I make an investment that's ultimately going to leverage up information that then enables the at-risk capital sector to go in and make their commercial plays?
So let me ask you just a quick follow-up to that then. At best, there are 2 Alaskas and perhaps 3 if you sort of scale out rail belt, other Alaska hubs, and rural Alaska. How do we make those kinds of investments when we won't have multiple competitors in most of those places in rural Alaska, and unlikely even in hubs? So how would your answer change if you're considering those issues about creating inclusiveness in our energy solutions?
Yeah, the rural sort of communities that on their face don't have competition are a challenge. And frequently we've met that through 2 things. One is targeted support, power cost equalization program, and then subsequent rounds of grant funding, particularly on the project development side. And I think that's where you can help invest and then see where the risk capital can come in and make those investments. I do think you want to be careful that you don't put more capital in there and go for 100% financing, because then it's not tied down to some at-risk. You need at-risk capital in the mix, even when you're in small communities. And the question is how much. So I do think there is some room there for sort of changing the mix, but you just want to be careful that you're not taking away competition at the margin. And it could even be competition between fuels. It's not just 2 entities competing head up on a particular thing.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate it. Thanks to everybody for your questions. And I'm going to bring Marianne back in here just in a second. And before I ask her to speak, I just lost her.
That's okay. That's okay.
Hang on just 1 second. Okay, there we go. Yeah, before I turn it back to Marianne, just again, a quick commercial. We have a number of events coming up in September and October, and encourage you all to go to commonwealthnorth.org for the events calendar. And just again, another quick pitch for the Hickel and Egan Awards celebrating Eric Wolforth and Diane Kaplan on October 10th. And with that, let me turn it back over to Marianne. Marianne?
Thank you so very much. And Mark, your presentation was so very appreciated, your thoughtful comments and answers to some of our questions. I think now more than ever, the energy issues that we're facing in Alaska are critical. I mean, we are shaping the future generations, and we need to make sure we get it right. So it's with the thoughtful analysis that you have provided over the years and kind of your forward look, the informed decisions and observations by the people on the call today as well, that I think we will be in a better place going forward as we look at the strategic options and make sure that what we're investing in is right for Alaska. Thank you all so very much. Have a wonderful weekend and take care.